Good afternoon. I'm glad you're here. My name is Ricardo Zapata. I'll be moderating this session. I'm a consultant to the EU on post-disaster and recovery peacebuilding processes. And we really want you to engage in this session and come up with some comments at the end on how to ensure inclusion and conflict sensitivity during the recovery context in affected countries by fragility and conflict. The session will certainly present some experiences from different disasters and conflict-related recovery processes and reflect on lessons learned with respect to integrating conflict sensitivity and ensuring social inclusion throughout a recovery process. The session will also highlight how integrating a conflict-sensitive approach in the tools for assessment and recovery programming, like post-disaster needs assessment, disaster recovery frameworks, recovery and peacebuilding assessments, social impact analysis and monitoring, etc., and the combined use of these with conflict sensitivity tools for analyzing the impact of assistance on peace and conflict dynamics, and how it can be used to help recovery processes and avoid the creation or exacerbation of tensions and effectively address the inclusion issue. We have the honor of having as speakers Mr. Mohamed Danjuma. He's the multi-sectoral crisis recovery project leader in Nigeria, the federal project coordinator for the Presidential Committee on the Northeast Initiatives in Nigeria. We have Clément Boutillier. He's a team leader on conflict sensitivity and peace building in the European Commission Director General for International Cooperation and Development, Fragility and Resilience Unit. We have Margaret Arnold, Senior Social Development Specialist at the World Bank, Rita Misal, Policy Specialist, Recovery Crisis Response Bureau at UNDP, and Sarah Chevala, Senior Program Manager, CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. I will not go into the lengthy CVs and experience that you have around the table, but certainly we're honored to have them here. And we would like to have a discussion on how this conflict sensitivity is key. And I think that the presentation that Sarah will make on how the CDA collaborative learning has long-standing experience in developing and refining approaches and tools on conflict sensitivity. And you want to ask her, Sarah, please, can you give us some examples of how these have evolved and worked in the field?
Sure. Great. Okay. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and to sit on a panel like this with such wonderful colleagues. So CDA, the organization I work for, was born out of the framework or out of the concept of do no harm. Our founder wrote do no harm in the beginning of the early 90s. So it underlies most of what we do. It's that realization that often well-intended aid can have unintended negative impacts in the context in which we work. It can be through how we target beneficiaries, how we deliver our services, who we deliver them to, who we work with. But it's understanding that if, as an organization, we do not understand conflict-sensitive approaches, we can undermine existing conflict dynamics, we can undermine existing local tensions, and we can create new ones. So CDA has developed from the Do No Harm framework and the foundation of the book. From there, we've done a lot of work focused quite specifically on accountability and feedback loops as well, so I'll bring that into the conversation. But really trying to shift the aid paradigm to be more people-centric and to ensure that we're listening to the voices of local people when we design and develop our programming. So just kind of to launch into an example, because I think it's just useful to use examples when we talk about this stuff as opposed to talking about it in a theoretical way. CDA's work really comes out of case studies and working with practitioners directly. So we commonly identify big questions for the field and then develop or identify how practitioners can go about addressing these challenges. So it's really practitioner-oriented. So in southern Pakistan, for example, the Iran caste tend to be wealthier and consolidate much more power than the Qasis caste. In the 2011 floods, for example, agencies, when they responded to the flood emergency, responded directly to the CASIS cast, not because of any kind of lack of impartiality, but because of the vulnerability. So they were looking at who was the most vulnerable in that context. Unfortunately, they didn't look at the larger dynamics between the groups. And in responding to the CASIS cast, what they ended up doing was aggravating the Iran cast. The group felt quite marginalized and angered towards the aid agencies and towards the CASIS cast, and it created more violence and intergroup tensions. And actually, the aid agencies had to leave for a while. So it just is a highlight of how if we don't look at the context in which we're operating, even if we have well-intended approaches, they can often make things much worse. So I thought it would be useful to kind of go through at a basic level of what conflict sensitivity is. So conflict sensitivity is not a theory, it's an approach. It's a way in which we analyze the local context in which we're operating in order to ensure that we acknowledge local norms, relationships, and other contextual features so that our intervention doesn't worsen the existing conflict dynamics or the existing relationships. Using a conflict-sensitive approach, though, does not mean that we're building peace, okay? It does not mean that we're solely addressing conflict dynamics. It means that we're aware of them in our approach and how we design and develop our approach. So it insists that we look at the unintended consequences of our actions in the context in which we're operating. So fundamentally, in order to operate with a conflict-sensitive approach, it requires 3 fundamental steps. First, foremost, understand the context in which we're operating. So understand the local dynamics, understand the local norms and traditions, understand the local perceptions of fairness, and not make assumptions. The second is to understand the interactions between the intervention and the context. So how does our intervention interact with the local dynamics? How do not only our intervention, but our operations, okay, so how do we procure things? How do our supply chains affect that? And how do our policies interact with the local context, okay? So it's looking at all the myriad factors of our agency within that context. And then finally, how do we act upon that understanding? So we now understand how we relate to the context. How do we act in order to maximize positive impacts and minimize or mitigate negative impacts? So through the years, as I said, CDA has deepened our lessons and our experience in this way and have developed a framework called the Do No Harm Framework. I'm sure many of you in the room have at least heard of it. But looking at the Do No Harm Framework allows us to understand and analyze the local context in a way that can enable us to develop programming that's responsive to local need and also responsive to local context systems. There's 6 fundamental lessons that I think are quite useful when we think about conflict sensitivity in these contexts. First and foremost, you're never neutral. I know it's a principle that we stand by, but we're never neutral, okay? In an intervention, our intervention becomes part of the context. So when you're in the context, you can either impact the context negatively or you can impact it positively, but you cannot be neutral. Second of all, every context are characterized by dividers and connectors. So what I mean by that are categories of things that can either bring people together or push people apart. Dividers and connectors can be things like systems and institutions, attitudes and actions, values and interests, experiences, symbols and occasions, but things that would drive people to come together or drive people apart. So our interventions, therefore, can increase or decrease the tensions, suspicions, mistrust, and therefore increase or decrease dividers, or they can increase and decrease trust, interdependence, and equality, which would be connectors within the context. So, as I said, you're never neutral, right? So in that context, when we develop our intervention, we need to think systematically about how our impacts affect the current dynamics within the context. Our interventions interact with the local context through our actions and behaviors as an organization. So we need to think about not only what we're delivering, that's quite important, but how, with whom, through what. Our actions and behaviors are what interact directly with the local context. So the details of our interventions are often the source of the impact. So looking at the intervention and how it works within the local context then can help us understand how our impacts are affecting the local dynamics. But on a positive side, don't worry, there's always options. So there's always ways to, once we understand the context, understand our intervention within the context, there's always ways to mitigate the context or to mitigate our negative impacts and enhance our positive ones. So just a couple more quick things that I think are quite essential to setting the tone for my colleagues at the panel. But there's several myths about conflict sensitivity that I think we need to bust right now. First and foremost, conflict sensitivity is not only applicable in violent conflicts, okay? Conflict sensitivity is not only applicable in context of post-conflict. Conflict sensitivity is also appropriate in context of latent conflict, okay? So conflicts that underlie tension, where underlying tensions have not yet erupted into violent or active conflict. Second is, time constraints mean we cannot listen. I hear this all the time. Well, this went so wrong, but we didn't have time to ask. And that's just not true. If we pause for a second, or if we find useful ways to understand the local context through our local partners, our colleagues in other fields, such as the development fields, we can better understand what the existing context is like in order to enhance how we respond. And then finally, conflict sensitivity and peace building. Conflict sensitivity and peace building are different, and I think it's important because I often hear aid agencies say, well, if we use a conflict sensitive approach, then we're building peace. And that's just fundamentally also not true. The distinction that I think is quite important is that if you're working on conflict sensitivity, you're working in a conflict context. So you're working in a context defined by either active conflict or latent conflict, but you're working in a conflict context. If you're using a peace building approach, you're working on conflict. And the distinction is quite important. You're working on features within that context that are building peace or are enhancing or mitigating drivers of conflict or enhancing positive impacts on peace. And so finally, I'm being told I need to hurry, but just to quickly discuss some of the tools and the evolution of do no harm, I think is quite essential. Just knowing that through the different steps of our program processes, there are ways to apply do no harm into all of our approaches. And if we do so, we can enhance how we design and develop our interventions. So there are participatory vulnerability assessments that can really enable us to better understand the context, can help us understand the capacity through internal capacity audits. In assessments, there's the good enough conflict analysis, which I think is a really useful tool to help us better understand quick snapshots of conflict, potential conflict drivers and flashpoints that we can utilize to better understand how to design and develop our intervention. We can utilize our local partners, our local staff to develop these things and to integrate them into our project designs and assessments. In design, it's essential to understand who we are working with. So who are we recruiting? How do they fit into the context? Especially if we're working with local partners, local staff, what's their role? In implementation, community-based participatory methods are really essential, and understanding how to engage community-based participatory methods. It's often a gap that our field staff are not versed in the methodology, but if you open up the door to it, it's quite useful to then integrate the feedback from those processes into conflict analysis. And then finally, monitoring and evaluation. Effective feedback mechanisms, not so much how we collect data, but how do we utilize the data to make course corrections, to make decisions is essential. How are we effectively listening to local people and adapting based on their perspectives? And then also setting up benchmarks, conflict benchmarks in our real-time evaluations, our after-action reviews, and our various evaluations tools can really help. So there are many ways and many tools and processes that can enable us to integrate conflict sensitivity and accountability into our work. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'm sure one way or the other, all our institutions try to engage in conflict sensitivity, and sometimes are confused by the myths and not really concentrated on what you said, particularly the benchmarks that will allow us to measure it. Now I'm going to ask Clément Boutillier, who works in the EU, to comment on and to bring us a perspective on how does the EU integrate and promote conflict-sensitive approach in its policies and interventions. Clément.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And it was actually very, very useful to have Sarah as the first speaker, so I don't have to go to explaining this concept, which is great because that's actually part of, that counts for a lot of time in my daily job, so thank you very much. So why and how the EU works on conflict sensitivity? Well, first of all, I would like to underline that it's a concept that maybe 10 years ago was not so much important in the policy framework, but has now become very much part of our higher policy and political documents. So, for instance, if you look at the EU Global Strategy, which was presented by Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the EU 2 years ago, it says very clearly that all our actions, external actions, so not only political actions, development, humanitarian, diplomatic, security actions, should be all conflict sensitive. If you look at also the new European Consensus on Development, which was adopted a couple of years ago, and that applies not only for EU institutions, but also for EU member states, it also says that all our interventions needs to be conflict sensitive. So in terms of intentions, I think we've taken a great step forward. And in these policy documents, usually you have three main important elements that are reflected. First, and maybe I will echo what Sarah said to some extent. First, conflict sensitivity is important not only in conflict-affected countries, but basically wherever we have development interventions, because as she said, you oftentimes have latent tensions and also already coping mechanisms that exist, and we need to take these into account when we do our interventions. The second point is that it's required for all development programs, so not only on security, not only on governance, human rights, but also whatever we do, education programs, health programs, we need to be aware of the context and be conflict sensitive. The third element that we have in our documents is that it applies to all actors of the EU system, and also, and perhaps sometimes it's not well known, to all our security engagements. So we have common security and defense policy operations. So basically, people from the military and the police would train people and advise people in our partner countries, and they also have to abide to conflict sensitivity principles. And what's interesting about recovery is that it's a time in the development process when you often have all these different strands and interventions taking place from the development, the political, security, and that's a critical juncture where conflict sensitivity is actually very important. And recovery in our system, we mean recovery from conflicts and man-made disasters, but also recovery from natural disasters. Because you have, and we've worked quite recently, for instance, on recovery after droughts in the Sahel, or after storms in Southern Africa, or earthquake in the Caribbean. And in our operation, we can very well notice that these natural disasters often exacerbate the tensions that exist. They reinforce imbalance and unequal access to resources. And they also sometimes, it's about perceptions, they often lead to an increase in the perception of corruption in many countries. So the risk, if you have a recovery process or framework which is not conflict sensitive, is basically to create another disaster after the natural disaster. So how we go about it to face and address this challenge in the EU system? The first thing that we have, and as it was highlighted, the first step to being conflict sensitive is making sure you understand the context in which you operate. And so with my colleagues in the EU, I work for the development cooperation part of the European Commission, but together with my colleagues from the European External Action Service, so the diplomats, our colleagues from ECHO, the humanitarian actors, we've come together to some guidance to work on conflict analysis, resilience analysis, risk analysis, to make sure that we have tools and processes that are useful to actually understand this context. Because we are also working and operating in the recovery phase, we deal with multifaceted crises, and there we not only look at doing joint analysis with our colleagues and within the EU system, also with member states, but also trying to do joint implementation and joint evaluation of our programs and projects, and making sure also in the implementation and in the evaluation and in the monitoring that we are conflict sensitive. Third point on the analytical part, on analytical tools, it's very important to us to work to make sure that we understand already the coping capacity and the local mechanisms to promote peace and resilience. And we are really trying to support and tailor our interventions to make sure that we enforce the systems and whatever the conflict resolution mechanism, the dialogue mechanism that already exist, instead of inventing new ones. And I recognize also very much in our work some of the challenges that we've been highlighted, so especially in recovery after natural disasters, you often face trade-off and challenges between time and pressure to intervene, but also the need to be inclusive and participatory, to reach out to civil society, for example, because if not, you run a risk of coming up with technical answers and not so much political and developmental ones. We also need to be, despite the time pressure, clear and transparent about our work, our intentions, because if not, we leave a limited space to our partners and to the local actors to be part of these processes, these recovery processes, to be part of their definition and of their implementation. But, that's my second point in terms of how we do it. Analysis is, of course, not enough. What we also need to work on and what we are working on is on the design, implementation, and evaluation of our interventions to make them conflict sensitive. So we've come up with specific guidance. So for all our programs and projects, so all the program managers that we have in EU delegations in the field, we ask them, we have like maybe 4 or 5 questions that they need to answer and address to make sure that they understand how their interventions will interact with the context in which we are working. We also work to support them with specific indicators, because once you've designed the projects and you implement it, you have to make sure that you have indicators to see how conflict sensitive you are. And also we work with our implementing partners to make sure that they themselves have conflict sensitivity mechanisms in their own operations. A third thing that we do is that we are doing quite a lot of training. So for our delegations in the field, but also for our colleagues in Brussels. Again, not only for development colleagues, but also for humanitarian colleagues, because that's something that this trade-off between urgency and conflict sensitivity is something that they are very well aware of. And fourth, we can also sometimes do what we call conflict sensitivity scan. So if we have had a number of projects and interventions in a region where we feel they are not conflict sensitive enough, then we can have a scan of all these ongoing operations at diplomatic, political, and development level to see how we can make them more conflict sensitive. So to conclude, I also wanted to highlight that conflict sensitivity in the EU approach is very much a way to promote social inclusion, because that's also the theme of this conference. And we have specific objectives for social inclusions in our policies. We have a number of tools to do it, but we are very clear about the fact that inclusion as an objective is best promoted by having conflict sensitivity approach and collective approach across the board in the EU system. Thanks.
Thank you, Clement. Sorry about being conflicted with time. We've heard now the basic conceptual elements of conflict sensitivity, how it is utilized by one of the major international partners. Now we're going to have a different perspective. How is it applied and perceived and implemented in a national context? And I think that in that sense, the presentation that's going to be done by Mohammed will be very illustrative. And how, and this is not a disaster context, this is a conflict disaster, this is a conflict area in which conflicts are overlapping. And we want him to address precisely that overlapping of conflict, fragility, and disasters. Mohammed, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be on the panel with such great capacities and experiences. And like you mentioned, our situation in Nigeria is peculiar because we have a conflict in the northeast Nigeria that is multi-hazard in nature because it's not only as a result of the conflict itself, but we also have natural causes in terms of climate issues and, of course, receding of resources that provide livelihood for the very agrarian people of the Northeast. And the sheer size of the landmass we're talking about is also something that has provided a lot of challenge, especially in recovery planning, which in our own case, I believe the 6 states that form the Northeast Nigeria have been in conflict for the past decade. And that has resulted in a huge humanitarian crisis, resulting to a displacement of over 2.4 million people, and loss of livelihood that runs into billions of dollars. So our situation, like I said, is peculiar to, not just peculiar to from one state to another. You find the 3 most affected states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe having their own peculiarity in terms of how they are affected by conflict. And the other 3 states are also affected as a result of the displacement and the pressure on the facilities there. So it requires multi-stakeholder, multi-sector, and also very, very huge resource to respond to that kind of conflict. But one good thing is the application of the Recovery and Peacebuilding Assessment that we have used as a result of the interaction between the World Bank, the EU, the state governments, the federal government, and also the donor partners. They came together to first of all come up with the baseline and do an assessment of what are the actual damage that has been done and how do we respond to that damage. So as a result of that, RPBA and post-RPBA brought about a series of concepts that we were using, things like prioritization and sequencing of activities, recovery financing. How do we ensure that there is a coherent recovery financing that takes into account the challenges of funding the huge needs in terms of the recovery needs. Coordination of the multiple stakeholders is also a challenge. How do we now ensure that there is a proper coordination and alignment of activities that will not amount to duplication of efforts or wasting of very scarce resources? And of course, how do we ensure that we fill the gap in recovery policy development where they are not existing, or where they are, where they are even available, we need to strengthen them. So some of these are the things that we have used. Finally, of course, is the monitoring and evaluation. How do we ensure that we continue to keep tab on how we progress in the recovery effort? So the post-RPBA phase brought about the Northeast Recovery and Stability Program that ensures that there's shared resources in managing the recovery, that takes into account the peculiarities from one state to another, and also ensures that very scarce resources are managed within the context of the needs of each state. And the community are also involved in the recovery planning and also implementation, just so that it is their needs that are met, not just a tailor-made recovery response that is shoved down to them, as it has been in other places. But very good results have it's been yielding very good results, where we find multilateral banks coming together to have shared resources, the World Bank, African Development Bank, and in some cases even Islamic Development Bank, rather than having different program or project management units, they have one unit that manages their recovery across the 6 states of the Northeast to ensure that there is complementarity of effort, and also that the investment financing is based on the priorities of each of the individual states' needs. So that also has proved to be very, very prudent in the deployment of the recovery activities across the 6 states of the Northeast. So I think without wasting too much time before you start writing, I know you've been saying, ours is a case that gives I think it's a model that is really working, even though it's a multi-stakeholder response. So it still presents that very huge challenge of coordination, where you need to ensure that everybody is on the same page. We share information as at when due, and people are focused on the needs of the people that sometimes are dynamic. I can give you a very practical example where we are having a conflict still ongoing in the state like Borno. And then even though we have done a 3-4-year plan that cuts across humanitarian needs and infrastructural needs in the states, but as at now, there is still displacement ongoing and secondary displacement, which now calls for some flexibility in the deployment of the funds to ensure that we cater for the humanitarian needs rather than focus on building infrastructure. Rebuilding livelihood is also very key to ensure that people get back on their feet. But it also presents another challenge, because people have been displaced to other places, to other communities that were not doing so well themselves. So how do you respond in such communities where almost everybody is vulnerable, not just the people that have been displaced into the community? So you are responding and ensuring that your response does not create another conflict, because people that are already impoverished have now to cater for other people that have been displaced from their own ancestral homes. So these are some of the nuances that we have been grappling with. But over and above, I think a more coherent recovery process through this shared institutional arrangement presents a very good model that seems to be working. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, it's quite interesting to see how these concepts have been translated in a very concrete case. And some key words come to mind: inclusion, participation, coherence, and of course communication and flexibility. You raise an issue that is very important. Not only the affected population of a disaster or conflict have to be taken into account, but those that in the community maybe are not severely affected but must be taken into account. Particularly when there's displacement, the host communities themselves need to be addressed to avoid conflict arising between the two parties that are there. So I think that's a very important element that you had. Thank you very much. Now we're moving to a different approach. Margaret Arnold, whom I know for some years back, she has been working on social impact analysis for a number of years. And it's quite interesting to have her perspective on what can the disaster recovery community learn from experience in addressing social inclusion during recovery. So what are, from your perspective, your knowledge, and of course the World Bank's, the tools that can help us to monitor success, or even more important sometimes, monitor failures and redress them?
Thanks, Ricardo. I think the disaster risk management community has quite a lot to learn from practitioners working on fragility, conflict, and violence, and recognize that most disasters happen in contexts of fragility, conflict, and violence, and that's the context we need to operate in. So one of the key things is just understanding that when we support communities in recovery, we cannot approach this as a solely technical process, because if we do that, we will fail, always. It's very much about social dynamics, power relations, as you've heard from all of my colleagues, understanding the pre-existing factors that contributed to the vulnerability in the first place, recognizing the impacts that relief recovery efforts have on all of these social relations and relationships, and regularly monitoring the social impacts of the disaster itself, but also of the recovery efforts, so that we can invest in actions, make course corrections, as Sarah mentioned. So when it comes to assessing damage and needs, the primary tool, as Ricardo mentioned in the beginning, is the post-disaster needs assessment. And I was just reminiscing with Ricardo as I came in to the room that, you know, back in the day when we first started doing these exercises, the first one that the World Bank got involved is we took ECLAC. Ricardo, as most of you know, is the father, we call him, of the PDNA process, and it was started by ECLAC, and we took that methodology and applied it in the Marmara earthquake in Turkey in 1999. And it was a fairly small exercise. There were 10 people looking sector by sector, and the goal was just to develop a credible number so that the government could go out and raise funds for recovery. And that was sort of the overall goal of these. Now, this has evolved over a number of years, as many of you know, and it's a much more elaborate and comprehensive approach, adding more sectors, also trying to collect some qualitative information to look at more social dimensions and inform a recovery framework. So it continues to evolve. Now, as part of that, several years back, our social development colleagues in the World Bank, as part of our own due diligence in working on post-disaster recovery, developed a social impact assessment and monitoring tool to take this a bit further and provide our government counterparts and PDNA teams with very practical tools on how to on the how to capture the social impacts in a very compressed time frame. So it's mainly qualitative, basic social science research tools like in-depth interviews, focus groups, participant observations, and it looks at different aspects of relief and recovery, social relations and cohesion, socioeconomic impacts, local institutions, so things like relations among different social groups, gender, age, ethnicity, religion, relations between households, villages, neighborhoods, collective action, access to social justice, social protection, crime and violence, livelihoods, many, many social issues, relations between leaders and community members. So we've used this tool in a number of contexts, including in Thailand after the floods in 2009, 2011, in the Philippines in 2009. And where we took it the furthest was in Myanmar, where we did regularly monitoring. We did regular rounds every year for 5 years between 2008 and 2013. So we had a panel of 40 villages in the 8 most affected townships, and went regularly interviewing about 1,500 villagers per round, and each round had, we looked at different issues. So we found regular things like that communities were not oftentimes not involved in the decision-making about aid, and that the emergency committees that were formed by the aid providers tended to negatively affect relations between villagers and their leaders. So the lesson of building on understanding the social context existing and building on what's there. And this affected this far beyond the recovery, beyond the period of aid delivery. So we were regularly monitoring the types of aid being given, and found that they often didn't match up with the expressed needs of the villagers. So again, it begged the questions of whose needs were being assessed and how can we make the course corrections to make sure that those are being met. And importantly, catching the issues that are being missed when you are just counting things, right? And who's being left out. So one interesting example was that the monitoring found that affected households had a spiraling problem of debt and high interest rates, and that casual laborers had been severely affected, but they were even more hurt by the lack of recovery assistance being given to landowner farmers, because they were overlooked by aid programs, and they were unable to recapitalize their farms and rehire those casual laborers. So all of this, these are the things that can get lost in the process. And there were a number of things around the social dynamics, but maybe I'll leave that because we're going to do a second round, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Margaret. When we do these kinds of assessment, be it in a conflict context or a peacekeeping process or in a disaster, we're addressing the issue of gaps. Gaps that can be objective, gaps that can be subjective or perception. And those are the ones, perhaps the latest ones, that bring more conflict. Gaps that are subjective and perceived by people and not necessarily addressed in objective terms. And that brings precisely the question, how do we address these and avoid enlarging the gaps by doing the wrong thing? So we must learn from experiences. Margaret mentioned how we began these exercises some decades ago, and we have been in a learning process. Development is not a straight move forward. It's more, I say always, like a tango, move sideways and backwards. But we're learning, and certainly one of the learning experiences is the one that the UNDP has been carrying forward, and look at the practice of how do we address this in disaster communities to better integrate conflict sensitivity into recovery interventions. The UNDP has completed a sensitive conflict guidance, and Rita Misal will address this. So Rita, please.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think I will save a lot of time by not going into detail, because a lot of the approaches have been already talked about by Sarah and Margaret before. We're exactly using the divider and connectors framework to do the analysis in how our assessment and recovery processes can affect communities. But what I just want to say, the intention for doing a conflict sensitive or having conflict sensitivity as a core principle in PDNA processes was there right from the beginning, when we started with the first guidance note in about 2012. And although it was enshrined as one of the core principles of our joint institutional approach to the way we do recovery, we hadn't actually till very lately come across the face of this, face this situation more often when we went into countries to do assessments. So we realized that the use of this instrument, the PDNA instrument, can be sometimes be a divider and can be a connector as well. Right? And so we have seen in instances when in Indonesia, an assessment and a recovery process became a connector, and the same approach in Sri Lanka after the tsunami became a divider, So recognizing that we don't, we are not neutral, as she mentioned, we don't operate in a political vacuum. Although I would say that we were actually invited to Gaza to do the assessment using the PDNA methodology because it is considered to me non-political. So just to say that we have a very detailed framework now. I will not go into the detailed framework, but the process, the guidance looks at not only the causes, which already was presented by both Margaret and Sarah, but also gives very clear instructions are prescriptive, they are very prescriptive, and it was deliberately so, to say that in the process when you start a PDNA, you don't try to do it in the assessment itself, you start from the beginning. That is, when you're selecting the geographical areas in which you're doing the assessment, the locations in which you go to the field visits, the type of sectors you assess, the assessment team members, that they don't represent a minority group, they are representative of both majority, minority, ethnic, they have consciousness about the issues and tensions when we do the baseline assessment. So the 5 steps of the PDN, which it is a baseline, studying the impacts, studying the needs, and then coming up with a recovery strategy, all these 5 steps they have outlined very clearly how we can use the dividers and connectors framework to actually build on each step and integrate conflict sensitivity. However, that said, I just want to say that I think there is increasingly the opportunity to use this tool, at the same time very much challenge to use this in the way it is in the guideline. Because we are working, as Margaret mentioned, in very compressed time scales, and I am telling you that more and more the demand is that you come up with an assessment like this and you give us a figure and don't go into any detail. I think it's fine. We know what our country is about. We know what the political landscape is here, what the political economy is here. We don't have to go into those figures. Just give us a dollar figure against which we can then move ahead. That is the approach that is taken. So while we are all very conscious of the fact that this is an integral part about how we should approach and do our assessments and do our recovery strategies, the space for doing that is not necessarily exist in any country. So we have to negotiate this process through when we start the assessment with our national government counterparts, the local groups, to say this is how we would progress in this particular assessment, and carve out niches somewhere across the space, maybe through the human impact assessment, maybe through the governance sector assessment, maybe through the gender assessment chapter, which then digs deeply into these aspects of the conflict sensitivity, or things that might be a potential for having tensions or escalating the tensions that already exist. So since we are going to go back into examples, I think I would like to stop here.
Thank you, Rita. Rita has pointed out a very important thing. Conflict sensitivity analysis is not a technical issue. It's very much a political one. And actually, when we start doing these assessments, the first conflict we have to address is the country's sensitivity to having their conflictivity exposed when we look at the background and we look at the context in which we are going to operate, because they fear that doing the laundry in the open can be conflictive in itself. And in that context, of course, the EU has a much more political approach, if you will. So I would ask Clément to comment on how does he see this UNDP tool, and how does it match, and how can it complement the conflict sensitivity approach from the EU perspective?
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo and Rita, for having outlined this new guidance. I think for us, we've been involved quite a lot in recovery and peace-building assessments, and also post-disaster needs assessment. And as Ricardo said, I mean, we are trying to be as political as possible in the way we operate with our different institutions and instruments. So we are very much supporting this drive to reinforce conflict sensitivity in recovery. We've been doing that in a number of situations for RPBAs, and we're actually looking forward to support this also on PDNAs. Thanks.
Thank you. Sarah, you have experiences from the World Bank, from the UN, from the European Union. So what could you suggest could be room for improvement on the application of these conflict-sensitive approaches? And what are, in CDA's views, the areas where further work might be necessary?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's 3 categories that I try to at least compartmentalize that we could really expand our experience and knowledge. I think first and foremost, with climate change, we're going to see an increasing amount of conflict, and our interventions are going to increasingly involve conflict dynamics, as Margaret pointed very explicitly to. And so we need to recognize that this is important, and we need to find new and systematic ways of integrating conflict sensitivity into our approaches, because it's going to become more and more an approach that we need to use. Secondly, I think something critical is that we have the tools. The tools exist. They're just not being systematically applied. And I think it's very surprising, to be really honest, this is my first time in a disaster reconstruction and resilience platform meeting. Most of my work sits in the humanitarian development world, and I'm just surprised. We need to connect with our colleagues on the other side. So we need to talk to them, because there's tools and processes that work. We have to find ways to systematically engage them. We have to make sure our field staff are adequately onboarded and have the skills. We need to ensure that we are building capacity off the existing capacities and structures. And then I would say the final piece, that this is just my little soapbox, is listening to local people. We need to remember that we need to listen to local people and find systems or utilize systems that can integrate their perceptions into our programming. It's not hard, but we need to prioritize it. We need to see community perceptions as a significant data point in which to adapt, develop, redesign in our nimble and fast ways that we can. I think constantly we see the challenge of power dynamics allowing for structures to replicate themselves. So the structures of our aid systems are ones that don't often enable local people to have a voice. And so we really need to challenge that system that we sit in, to flip that paradigm in order to allow the voices of local people to really influence what we're doing and how we do our work. So.
Thank you. Quite a big challenge. Margaret, you have a large experience in this, and actually mentioned the case of Myanmar and Cyclone Nargis, which happened in what could qualify as a politically very challenging context in a country that is still being challenged in many ways. Maybe knowing this experience, you could perhaps give some more light on how can tools like the social impact analysis and the social impact monitoring, which you described in Mark, we complement the PDNA and help us ensure inclusiveness in the assessment and, more importantly, in the recovery processes, and how to monitor that.
Okay, so I think the monitoring is one of the key things, and the assessment itself, that it's, talking directly to affected communities and getting their voices in the process. I think those are the two key things, and doing that consistently, because needs change, priorities change, and doing one-off assessments is important, but that's what they are, one-off assessments, so we need to keep going back. This Nargis happened at a very interesting time in Myanmar, and the monitoring process found some very interesting things on the issues of social cohesion. So just to give you a couple examples, we found that the better off families, so overall social relations remained pretty strong, but in many of the villages the bonds were getting weaker, especially in heterogeneous villages. So for example, we found that better off families in many of the villages used to sponsor religious activities before Nargis, but they were no longer able to afford them. So that deprived the villagers of really an important mechanism and venue to strengthen social cohesion amongst them. And there was a lot of out-migration due to the economic stresses. So there were less working hours for people to socialize and maintain those social relations. And then there was, the external aid coming in often was provided along religious lines. So that didn't help. The survey found that people were dealing with each other more carefully because they were no longer comfortable engaging with each other. So the aid provided didn't help the situation in cases. But overall, speaking on the whole of Myanmar, villagers maintain pretty good social bonds in spite of the deterioration of relationships elsewhere in the country. And the monitoring found that strong local leaders played a really critical role in doing that. And in some cases where elder religious leaders had passed away, that became a factor because younger people didn't maintain those relations. So I think, these were really insightful findings for us in terms of informing and going forward with the recovery and just understanding what disasters do to the sort of community's immune system around its ability to recover. So, and I just want to make the point that Sarah made, that these, we have so many tools, as you heard, but we don't consistently apply them. We've done this in 3 cases, but we respond to so many, and we need to be doing it more often.
Thank you. And you illustrate also the issue that there's no such a thing as a neutral intervention. One way or the other, it can be unintentionally harmful instead of the opposite. Now let's go back to the practice on the ground. So I would ask Mohammed to address this. And how is your program addressing climate and disaster risks in such a complex situation and remaining conflict sensitive? Particularly because, as Sarah said, climate change is certainly one of the drivers of conflict now.
So most of the, so all of the projects that have been designed in terms of the recovery by the different multiple partners are being done within the context of building back better. So which means, in essence, that we are not only going to recover, even if it's a livelihood or infrastructure, to the way they were before the conflicts, but try to see how we can improve them, in taking into cognizance some of the drivers of the conflicts that include climate change itself. For the Northeast Nigeria, that is mostly agrarian, that is also very challenged now by desertification in some area, and a lot of land that used to be arable is progressively and increasingly becoming less arable, and people are forced to seek for other forms of livelihood as a result of this kind of climate change is there. And also simple things like fuel, seeking for fuel for basic activities like cooking has also exacerbated the issue of desertification, because trees have been felled continuously. So in line with this, taking into account some of these challenges, we ensure that in all of the recovery programming, these things that will enhance, and for example, smarter cooking stoves that are more efficient, some of the things that are provided as returning kits to the displaced persons, so that they are not even exposed to going to look for firewood and all that ultimately not only put them at risk, but also continues to exacerbate the issues of the desertification. And also smarter use of agricultural inputs, that will ensure that they increase productivity, and the small arable land that is left produces more, that will enhance their income in terms of livelihood. And even in rebuilding the infrastructure, things like solar, renewable energy have been incorporated into the wash systems, and of course other infrastructure in the health system, just so that we take into account some of the things that were not in place before the advent of the disaster. So these are some of the things that we have been ensuring that we incorporate into the design. And this is also done with the community, just so that it's sustainable. And of course, there is ownership at the end of the day. That's just to name a few of some of the things that we're doing.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to elaborate a bit more. You said by introducing modern cooking techniques, by introducing other forms of energy, other ways of doing things how does that clash, or how does that conflict or not with cultural practices, ancestral ways of doing things? I've seen communities where they say, okay, you can use energy produced by biogas, and people, for cultural reasons, will reject it, or say that the food that's not cooked in wood doesn't taste the same. How do you cope with those issues?
Yeah, so the currency for us is one that the conflict is still ongoing. Mm-hmm. And people are still at risk, especially if for example, this specific example that I used for the cooking. The first thing is people usually travel 2-3 kilometers just to go and fetch firewood. And that also puts them at risk. Now, so it's common sense that it's better you embrace this new technology that will ensure that you are safe and gives you more efficient fuel. So those kind of advocacy is one of the things that we've done to ensure that the community embrace some of this new smart technology that will help them. So it's killing two birds with one stone at the same time, which ordinarily will have presented some form of, because people are always resistant to change, especially if they are set in their ways of doing things. So, but the currency in this situation is, in some places, the insecurity is still rife. So we use that as the sentiment with which we can get them to imbibe these new forms of doing things in their homes. And also agriculture, where you have to travel kilometers to access your farmland, and you do not have that same opportunity now. So the little you have, you try to ensure that you use it more efficiently and enhance productivity within the context of the conflict itself. So these are some of the ways that have provided. It's like changing tire on a moving car. It's very, very difficult.
Thank you very much. Very interesting comparison. So, Rita, talk about changing tires in a moving car. What are the challenges of integrating conflict sensitivity in this fast-running car of PDNAs that replicate by the dozen per year?
Yeah, almost at that rate we are going. So that's as I said, I already mentioned, we really don't have any answers, particularly because we have partners who think that the approach should be like a very quick and dirty assessment, so that we provide a figure that will help the government to immediately plan a recovery. That makes sense in certain contexts. It does make, because there is a urgency for that. At the same time, then we realize these are the things that fall under the cracks. And so it's a long negotiating process with the government to make them understand in the longer run, this is what you need to understand, because any recovery process is not, it cannot be neutral, as I would say. By just building a school doesn't ensure that you will have education. It is people who have access to the quality of education, people who have the right teachers, then the education goal will be met. It is not just putting the building there. The same for health services as such. So it's not about reconstruction of buildings, but it's rather about recovery of people and their capacities so that they would have equitable access. So this is a point that we have to actually be able to negotiate with the government who invites us or commissions a PDNA through the international partners. And otherwise, that is the first kind of space that we seek for. The second, as I say, we have tried to be as creative as possible. In Somalia, I think that was easy because the government understood that drought is a driver for the conflict, and the impacts of the drought is escalating tensions more and more. People's access to land, water, and other resources are the ones that give rise to differences within communities. Equitable access to these resources are an issue that they have to address, and so Somali assessment did that quite successfully. That does not mean they were able to address it to what extent they're addressing it, but just recognition of the root causes of this natural phenomenon that they think is drought is in itself for a very good beginning for the space that they are getting. The second, thing that we have found, I think, we always, like you mentioned, seek to bring in now more and more creatively people who understand the context much better. than just looking at the disaster and its impact. But to look at what was the development challenges that existed before that caused the disaster. And then once you start looking at the development challenges and do that kind of analysis, even addressing like what brings people together, what are the factors that have made this a disaster, these unaddressed issues, to put it down as something in the different chapters of the PDNA has helped actually to kind of contextualize it, to kind of crystallize the issues that the government need to address in the long run. That's the third. But, I don't want to end with things that we are not able to do. Like you said, in the conflict, Sarah also said, and the guideline also very clearly says, you don't have to be in a conflict context to apply the conflict lens. You apply the conflict lens in any context you're working. So in Hurricane Maria and Irma, following the PDNA or big assessments, in, say, the British Virgin Islands, there's no conflict context there. Apparently, you would go there is no conflict context there. It's a very, cohesive community on the other hand. But the government took time and went over the recovery plan through 60 consultations with various separate groups of people. It took time, more than 3 months of time for them to just go around, and then there were revisions to it, and finally the process got a parliamentary approval, and now it is is a reconstruction plan. So again, the second factor and the most important factor, as I mentioned first, is again the government leadership on this process. It's not us who can do it. It would be the government. If the government gives priority to this issue and provides the leadership, in case of BVI, the Prime Minister himself attended some consultations. Of course, in other countries may not be possible that the Prime Minister would himself go for consultations. But I think he would have this directive given to his departments and ministries and sectors to tell them that I want this to be going through a round of public consultations so that we have a document that does not become us versus you, but it is our collective recovery plan. And that's what was arrived at BVI. So I'll just stop with these two examples.
Thank you. I don't know if the other panelists would like to make some comments, some additional reflections.
I would just echo what Rita just said in terms of the application of conflict sensitivity in any context. Hurricane Katrina had a lot of negative impacts on local communities. Now, it's arguable if the U.S. is a conflict context at the current moment, but when Katrina hit, it was quite apparent that if they had used a more systematic analysis of local communities, it would have enabled them to better enhance the application of the response. We have case studies on context there, as well as in Canada, for example, with IP communities, Indigenous people communities, and looking at how natural disasters may affect them differently, and how that's created tensions between local groups and aid agencies in Canada. And so those are contexts in which you would not necessarily think conflict dynamics matter, but they do. And maybe conflict dynamics isn't the right word, but they're the context. It's understanding the local context in which we're operating. So just to underscore Rita's point.
May I just add one point to it? I think the most complex issue happens when we are doing the housing, land, and settlements assessment. That is where we face the biggest challenge in recognition of rights to these resources for construction of houses, which may have been for generations belonging without any legal paper. It must have been just passed down. They have possessed it for 15 years, 20 years, and it's all raised down. But when, after a disaster, during the recovery process, you want to give the house, that's what is planned, but there is no land anymore because there is no legal proof. So there has to be some ways to document that community live there. Others have to agree. The local government has to then regularize this process before a house is constructed. Give them a deed to say this is your land and based on which they build their house. So this is one of the most challenging and the space that has the ability or potential to have the greatest conflict. And so that is something that we face on an everyday basis when we are reconstruction of houses, particularly of houses. And so in Nepal now, where the recovery is going on, there are many communities who traditionally own the land without a piece of paper. So the government has given them additional resources to landless people to buy land, but also to some people to regularize the land that they were living on so that they can construct the house. So these aspects, the more you delve deeper into it, the more challenging it gets, and you have to address that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to also underscore that very last point she made about housing, which is also a practical example I can give you from the recovery and peacebuilding assessment that was done. Like I mentioned, over 2.4 million people were displaced. And that displacement was not just as a result of them being displaced from their ancestral homes. You will find that most of these homes have been completely razed down or destroyed by the insurgency, especially in Borno, Adamawa, and some parts of Yobe State. So after the assessment, even though the assessment identified the need in terms of housing, but in the recovery planning, none of the partners wanted to touch housing because of the potentials of conflict. So you find the multi-sectoral crisis recovery project of the World Bank only concentrating in health, infrastructure, education, WASH, and peace building and social cohesion. And that of African Development Bank, the same thing, it's basic services in the four sectors like that. So it's only the government that is left with the issue of housing. How do you, because of these title issues and all those other underlying nuances that may become another source of conflict if we even begin to attempt to address the issue. So I think it's a very, very valid point she made there.
Just to highlight, so our work at CDA has adapted our frameworks quite a bit over the years, and about 3 or 4 years ago, we recognized the issues of land tenure across the spectrum as a real big challenge. So not only in disaster risk reduction or in preparedness or response, but also in humanitarian approaches, development approaches. So we've adapted the Do No Harm tool to focus specifically on land. So it's another resource. Again, it probably needs additional adaptation for the sector, but largely there are ways to think about do no harm and conflict sensitivity within land tenure. So,
thank you. I think now it's time to give the floor the chance to also express comments and questions. So I would open the floor for some questions. Yes, would you please provide the microphone to the lady over there, and then here? Okay.
My name's Christopoulos. I'm a consultant. I have two related questions. One is, particularly with Sarah's presentation, one word I heard again and again and again was the word we. Given the commitments from the World Humanitarian Summit and Grand Bargain, et cetera, all towards localization, providing not just resources but power to local civil society. I'm wondering a bit about who we is and what difference this is making to who we is.
Or who them are.
The fact that resources are going to local actors with a political agenda who are not designing interventions to be conflict sensitive, but to actually, engage in their political agenda, and how is that affecting things? And the other question is related to the point you raised, I think, around Katrina and a few other points. Given the nature of inequality in the world and the changing nature of inequality in the world, the conflicts are proportionally less about conflicts between different local actors, but they're between local actors and macro-level actors. And I'm not saying these conflict sensitivity tools can solve everything. Of course, maybe they aren't equipped and they aren't possible to use for addressing these things, but how do you avoid them becoming a bit of a fig leaf for a micro-macro conflict? Take Puerto Rico. It's a conflict between local social justice warriors and the guy with the paper towels. You have need a different tool for that.
Thank you. My name's Katie Peters from the Overseas Development Institute. We've been looking over the last sort of 5 or 6 years at this idea of what happens when disasters and conflicts collide. And we started off by asking, actually, how do you take more adequate consideration of violence, conflict and fragility, not only in reconstruction processes, but also in disaster risk reduction more broadly? And I wanted to ask the panel, I mean, we've been talking a lot about conflict sensitivity, which I absolutely agree with the argument that the DRR community, of which I consider myself to be one, has not gone anywhere near far enough in systematically integrating conflict-sensitive approaches. But I wanted to ask, I mean, if we did do that, is that sufficient? And I ask this because essentially what we've discovered over the last few years that there's very much a continuum, and I think we have a decision to make as a DRR community. Do we want to just tweak existing approaches, so integrate principles of do no harm, for example, into things that we do already to simply know the context better? Or do we want to actually try and be more innovative? Do we need to be actively reaching out as a disaster risk reduction community to peace building, conflict prevention specialists? Or do we need to find solutions beyond the current system? You know, do we need to be doing things that we're just not even thinking about at the moment, like integrating disaster risk reduction outcomes into disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs, for example? I mean, there are small examples of where this is happening positively, but they are very, very few and far between. Or maybe that's just far too far, and we don't even want to entertain those ideas. But yeah, I'd be really interested to know from the panel, is this about tweaking business as usual approaches, or do we need to be radically thinking beyond outside the box?
Floor to the panel. Say we had to the comment that the gentleman made that the conflict is not only between social groups in a conflict situation, but also between the municipal and local level, the national institutions, and even among the development partners that somehow Rita hinted. So that's an issue that should be addressed. So, and yes,
maybe I'll start with Katie's. I mean, in terms of, I think we do need to do things very differently. I mean, in the World Bank, in fact, it was, I mentioned having this technical approach, and a lot of that has been disaster risk management practitioners as engineers and finance experts and things approaching things. And it's still, we had to struggle to make sure, and it still doesn't happen every single time, that we have a strong social team on a PD&A team and on the recovery team. So that's happening more and more. But in the social development sector, where I come from, we look more at just all kinds of risks together, right? Because you can't distinguish between the natural and the man-made. It's just one big ball of risk, particularly at the community level. So doing it very differently, and that's why we developed the social impact assessment and monitoring to hopefully do that differently. So I think we need to still make more progress, but we do definitely need to do things differently. And on the localization, you raised some interesting points, Ian. I think it is about giving power to local actors. In the case of Myanmar, and even when you're doing the analysis and those type of things, it's identifying local actors there. In Myanmar, we worked through a local academic institution. They did the research. So it wasn't us going, doing our supervision. And making sure to work with the government so that we have very strong policies now around identifying the stakeholders, making sure that everyone benefits, making sure there's plans, that there is analysis of who is there, that the citizen engagement is part of it, so that there is some accountability and exchange and dialogue and feedback for the sort of local to macro issues. So I don't think we're where we need to be, but working towards that, because I think that's where we need to go.
I just wanted to also add a couple of points. I think you've raised very pertinent issues as to how far we can go, or are we doing enough. Well, for the last question, it's easy. No, we are definitely not doing enough. And, although we have made a start and we have these frameworks and guidelines, translating them into action is not as easy as we would like it to be. Two things that first, the conflict-sensitive guide to a PDNA recommends very strongly that you add to your assessment team a conflict specialist, conflict prevention specialist. That they recommend very much, especially in countries where have been recognized conflicts already. Definitely in that team, there should be no compromise on the fact that you should have a conflict prevention specialist as part of the PDNA. Secondly, as Margaret just mentioned, I think the recognition, the issue of risk is no longer, it's not a dynamic disaster or conflict. It's not a straight-jacketed concept any longer. It's much more fluid and dynamic that moves between a disaster and a conflict risk. So it's more viewed as from the lens of resilience building for any shocks in UNDP, particularly in our strategic plan. We are talking about resilience to shocks. And one of the shocks could be economic shocks, like, from stocks and things like that happen in the US, but it could be also disasters, it could be also conflicts, it could be the Ebola as well, that has regional impacts on the economy and lives of people and everything. So it's not about any one particular that is straight-jacketed. So we have this resilience team or the thematic solution within UNDP's strategic plan that actually has these dimensions of risk. And so there is a much more stronger interchange of skill sets that is required to deal with any particular risk. So it's not like disaster risk management experts have to deal only with. So if there's a huge livelihoods related issue, or even in Ebola, there were people who went from the livelihood stream, the social recovery team. So there was a multidimensional team to look at the multidimensional nature of risks. And I think that is increasingly the approach that organizations are beginning to take, as it's only in this strategic plan that it is quite nicely articulated, because the recognition is that we no longer are dealing with anything called a disaster, which is not having underlying conflict dimensions to it. Thank you.
Always. So I think they're really quite pertinent questions, and I would agree. I think to the question from the woman from OECD, Katie, I think do no harm or application of conflict sensitivity is we're not there yet. And so it's not a question of either or. It's, to my mind, it's yes and. You need to, I think the application of conflict sensitivity, or the enhanced application, and application at the field level, not in our rooms like here in Geneva, but in actual practice, is where we need to start focusing our energy, and then actually thinking more innovatively. What other techniques and tools do we need? So I think it's not an either or, but it's kind of a progression of thinking. And then to the other comment over here, specifically about the micro-macro conflict dynamics, there are systems and tools to analyze that. I mean, taking a systems approach and really looking at the system and causalities within a system can help you then identify what micro-level conflict dynamics are impacting macro-level and vice versa, and which ones aren't. We found through systems analysis that you can really see how oftentimes microcosms of localized conflict do not impact macro-level conflict and vice versa. So a whole field of study on it, and I think it could actually be quite useful to influence some of the work that we do in this sector, to be thinking more systematically about local systems and macro systems and how they interact.
Thank you, Clément.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, where I'm sitting, we are working on conflict sensitivity and resilience issues, and that's actually quite a comfortable position, because that means that in our system, we can have a say and a look at different strategies and thematic areas. So be it disaster risk reduction or education or health, we are part of the conversation for all these thematic areas and projects in our system. We are also part of country team, what we call country team meetings. So when you have an involvement and engagement in a given country, we are there to support our colleagues to think creatively on how they can do things better, not only in terms of development, but also in terms of our other engagement. And that brings me to something we've tried to do lately, is to think more at a strategic level with theory of change approach. I mean, in development we have had theory of change for quite a while, but what we are trying to do is for the EU to think strategically with diplomatic instruments, election support, development programs, how we can take a step back from what we've been doing in a given country and rethink causality, rethink how sequencing of instruments and coordination of instruments to make sure that we have a greater impact. And I think that's also the lack of being part of the EU. We have, and as the colleague said, many of the conflicts are at different levels, from macro to very locally present. And we have different tools that we can mobilize, like track one mediation to area-based approach, that we can try and coordinate to make sure that we have an impact on different onions of the conflict, and that's not necessarily been the case before, but that's something we're working towards too. Yeah.
I will give the last.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's been a very robust and productive discussion so far. But my takeaway is, while these tools are all very good tools, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. It has to take into account the peculiarities of member nations, and of course the political economies therein, within the context of their peculiarities, and harp very importantly on the participation of locals, just so that they can become sustainable and reach the desired impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank you all for your presence, particularly the panelists. I think it was a really enriching discussion. Thank you all very much.